The history of the United States can be told through the waves of people who've made new lives here.
When people talk about the European settlers who came to America, almost every national group is mentioned. The English, the Germans, the French, the Italians, the Dutch, just to name a few. But there's one group that's rarely mentioned, the Scots-Irish.
And yet this culture shaped America, opening up frontiers, fighting for independence, and creating the very basis of American democracy. This is my culture. Everywhere I look, I see the impact of the Scots-Irish on modern American life, our military, our churches, our music. It can truly be said that the Scots-Irish settlers did not merely come to America, their values became America. And to understand our world, we need to understand theirs. So I'm on a journey across continents to tell the incredible, forgotten story of the Scots-Irish. Why did they struggle so hard to reach America? What did they hope to find out in the wilderness? How did their old Scots-Irish traditions shape the culture of this new nation? And why have the countries that owe them so much, Scotland, Ireland, and America, forgotten their own ancestors, these men and women who were born fighting? Fight, sing, drink, pray. These words lie at the heart of the Scots-Irish culture in America. But they were born an ocean away in the wilds of ancient Scotland. Here, the ancestors of today's Scots-Irish proved their fighting spirit against the mighty Roman Empire. Battled for freedom under William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, and were willing to die to defend their fundamentalist faith. In the 1600s, tens of thousands of these Scots brought their values with them to the north of Ireland, part of an organized British plan to settle land taken from the Irish Catholics. Life in Ireland took an unexpected turn. The Scottish settlers endured a century of warfare, divided from both the Catholic Irish and the ruling Episcopalian English by their culture and Presbyterian identity. And in Ireland, these struggles created a new people, the Scots-Irish. In 1704, the government imposed new laws designed to crush the growing strength of this people. They were precluded from holding public office. Many lost their jobs. Even their ministers were declared illegitimate. They'd become second-class citizens in a land they'd fought to make their own. I've come to the village of Bonnie Before, just outside Belfast, where Andrew and Elizabeth Jackson lived in the 1760s. Yeoman farmers and weavers, they made enough money to survive, but not to prosper. Presbyterian, educated, ambitious, they decided, like so many Scots-Irish, that opportunity lay an ocean away. When Elizabeth and Andrew Jackson left for America, they brought with them a set of strong democratic beliefs, beliefs born in Scotland, hardened here in Ulster: the right to dissent, the right to resist oppression, the right of ordinary people to choose their own leaders, and a pretty strong dislike of the English. They passed these principles on to their son, one of my great political heroes, Andrew Jackson, 7th President of the United States and the father of American popular democracy. But why choose America? Vitally, most of America's East Coast was under British control. There was no language barrier, and plenty of good farmland was available. But the strongest reason for many of them to choose America lies in this field of flax. This Northern Irish Heritage Park reminds us of the great importance of the flax crop for Scotch-Irish farmers. How are you?
Hello, how are you?
Flax was spun, woven into linen, and then sold to support their families. There was a continual demand for more flaxseed, and America was the biggest supplier.
Bye-bye.
By 1775, 3/4 of all cargo that American ships were bringing into Northern Irish ports was flaxseed.
The American ships coming into Derry and Belfast opened up a whole new world for the Ulster Scots. They heard news of vast expanses of land rich with fertile soil, ripe for the taking in an American colony that was purely Protestant in faith. The Ulster Scots believed God wanted them to work hard to improve their lot. America sounded like the promised land.
It made perfect sense for the ship's captains to claim that America was a land of milk and honey. Having unloaded their flaxseed in Ireland, they needed a cargo to fill their holds for the return voyage. And a human cargo of paying passengers was the ideal solution. At this reconstructed brig, Eric Graham is explaining just how grim conditions were.
How many people would have been on board?
Well, about 25 crew, 100 to 130 passengers. They'd be forced down those hatches and be crammed like sardines. Because they're designed to carry flax boxes rather than people. So they could spend 10, 12 weeks in the high seas. And, you know, it is absolutely beyond imagination what they suffered.
Food and water often ran low, sometimes with horrible results, as the friend of one unfortunate passenger recalled.
The passengers and crew were at length reduced to the necessity of eating the bodies of those who died. Even this resource failed them, and at length Mr. Fisher was selected to give up his life to preserve the lives of the rest.
You can imagine what it must have been like for my ancestors and others to walk into a hold like this and look around and see 300 other people and realize you're going to be here for up to 3 months with no privacy, no hygiene, even having to swap out sleeping spaces. They must have wanted this pretty badly. I'm amazed at their determination.
Between 1717 and 1775, hundreds of thousands of Scots-Irish endured this crossing to America. They were willing to roll the dice, settling in an unknown wilderness, and leaders in the American colonies wanted their independence and fighting spirit. Irish-born James Logan, Pennsylvania's chief land agent, understood the hardy Scots-Irish character. The pacifist Quakers who controlled Pennsylvania's affairs couldn't bring themselves even to form a militia. But to the west, there was a growing threat.
The Quakers who dominated Pennsylvania politics were not fighters, and there were Indians out on the frontier.
Logan wanted to plant a string of buffer settlements between the Indians and the towns in the east. He knew the Scots-Irish were perfect for the task.
James Logan sets out to encourage these Ulster Scots to come over and settle on the frontier in western Pennsylvania, seeing them, I think, as kind of hardened, seasoned frontiersmen.
Logan put out the call, setting up a tract of land he called Donegal, and the Scots-Irish did come. Thousands crossed the ocean, spilling straight from the ports into the empty unknown of the American wilderness. There were no schools, no stores, no churches, nor even roads. If a loved one was sick, or if there was an Indian attack, they were on their own.
I've spent a lot of my life driving along these roads thinking about how lucky I am and what it took for people to come out here and make a home in an unimproved wilderness and to leave everything that they knew behind, not knowing even what was over the next mountain.
Logan's policy started a flood which ultimately transformed America. His idea of using Scots-Irish communities as a defensive buffer caught the imagination of other leaders, such as Governor Gooch down here in Virginia. Virginia was a British colony with an aristocratic society in the east. But in the West, there was turbulence and hardship. In the 1730s, Gooch lured the Scots-Irish into the mountains. He offered them land in the Shenandoah Valley and one other key incentive.
One of the principal concessions he made was to guarantee them that they would have the freedom to worship.
Religious toleration, the right to own land, everything the Scots-Irish had been denied was offered here, and they seized the opportunity. From 1740 onwards, the road south of Philadelphia became an immigration highway filled with tens of thousands of settlers pushing their way through the Shenandoah Valley into the Carolinas or out towards Tennessee. They traveled in groups of families, keeping their memories, stories, and shared culture alive, and making the mountains their home. Thomas Lackey, one of my many times great-grandfathers, was only 16 when he left Derry in the north of Ireland along with the Millers, the McKnights, the Leaches, and the Boggs, and headed for America. And this is where they finally stopped walking, the Natural Bridge of Virginia. Today, the Natural Bridge is a tourist mecca, but in 1740 it was a wilderness. In these backwoods, the early settlers needed to restart their lives from scratch.
In the wagons, they would have had what few possessions they could carry. Often this would be just the clothing they could put in a chest, perhaps a few rudimentary pieces of furniture. But clearly they planned in that journey that whatever they needed on that frontier, they'd be making for themselves.
These hardships were unsettling and sometimes surprising. Robert Witherspoon was a small child when his family reached South Carolina in 1734.
When we arrived and found nothing but a wilderness, and no other than a mean dirt house, our spirits quite sank. As evening came on, the wolves began to howl on all sides. We then feared being devoured by wild beasts, having neither gun nor dog, not even a door to our house.
But the new arrivals were about to discover that the wolves were the least of their worries. The Scotch-Irish settlers moving through the Shenandoah Valley in the 1700s soon discovered that they weren't alone. Several Indian nations used the valley as a highway and as an ancient hunting ground. They had no concept of land ownership. To them, you could no more own the land than you could own the air. The Scots-Irish and the Indian tribes, both notoriously fierce fighters, were suddenly face to face in a cultural minefield. Initially, the two groups kept their distance. The Indians continued hunting, and the settlers marked out farms. But soon the Scots-Irish were probing other lands, and the Indians were showing up among the settlements.
30 to 50 armed men might show up in your front yard and say basically what's for supper. One of the early settlers described them this way. He said they will make themselves cooks and stewards if you don't feed them. In other words, they'll come in and they will, as he put it, spare nothing.
Relationships between the Indians and the settlers on the frontier soon became tense.
It's always a little bit edgy. Not necessarily confrontational, but also not without the possibility of confrontation.
In Ireland, the Scots-Irish had seen just how quickly the frontier could become the front line. And in 1754, tensions on Virginia's borders erupted. When the British entered the French and Indian War, the Scots-Irish quickly made a name for themselves as unflinching frontier fighters. Scots-Irish brought strong military skills with them from the north of Ireland and quickly adapted to the frontier. The American Indians knew every tree and trail in this land and were determined to protect their sacred hunting grounds. When the two clashed, it was fierce and bloody. Scots-Irish militiamen served the interest of the British, but it was their own future they were protecting.
I think for the most part, the Scotch-Irish chose to stay rather than flee. That was maybe part of their nature, is this is my land and I'm going to stay here and I'm going to protect it. And if I have to, I will fight those Indians.
Stay and fight they did. For 10 years, Scotch-Irish settlers fought the Shawnee, Delaware, Cherokee, and Ottawa tribes with heavy losses on both sides. In 1763, the French and Indian War finally ended. France abandoned many claims to the west, and Britain tightened its grip over America's east coast. And now, isolated from British colonial rule to the east, the Scots-Irish frontiersmen settled into their American roots. As always, they were self-sufficient.
In remote frontier settlements such as this one, men and women worked together in the fields. The women made the family's clothes from linen or from the tanned hide of animal skins. Life on the frontier was hard.
The Scotch-Irish had turned their backs on the bigotry of British rulers in Ireland and America's colonial towns to live as they wanted on the frontier. But when curious outsiders came to visit their settlements, some brought all of the old prejudices with them.
The Anglican Reverend Charles Woodmason kept a detailed diary in which he made clear his intense dislike of the Scots-Irish, at one point calling them the refuse of the earth. He seemed to find Scotch-Irish women particularly unsettling. The young women have a most uncommon practice, which I cannot break them of. They draw their shift as tight as possible to the body and pin it close to show the roundness of their breasts and slender waists, so that they might as well be in puri naturalibus. Naked, in other words. In your dreams, Reverend Woodmason.
This frontier lifestyle may have unsettled the occasional outside visitor, but it was also a world apart from the more sophisticated life in American towns. Then, in 1775, the two groups discovered that they needed each other. The Scots-Irish settlers valued the freedoms they'd sought and finally found in America. Among the elites, men like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington were also demanding freedom, ready to break away from England and start a new nation. Revolution hung in the air. The Declaration of Independence captured the dreams of both groups.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
These dreams, these truths, would only be won with a fight. On April 19, 1775, the local militia in Lexington, Massachusetts fired at British forces. The shot launched a revolution. The Scots-Irish were quick to enlist.
I think there was no question among most of the Scotch-Irish that they were going to line up against the Crown in this battle. An attitude I think they'd brought with them from Scotland to Ireland to America. They had had a snootful of British rule, and so the patriot cause was for them the only way to go.
General George Washington led America's troops. They were fighting for liberty. Britain was fighting for a key part of its empire. For 5 difficult years, the war seemed to shift with every battle. By 1780, it looked like the British were going to outlast the rebellion. But down here in the Scots-Irish stronghold of the mountain south, the British overplayed their hand. These settlers had spent more than a generation perfecting a new form of fighting skills. From day one on the frontier, they'd been part of their local backcountry militia, and they needed no training in weapons or tactics. British Major Patrick Ferguson thought they'd be easy to defeat. He taunted the Scots-Irish, threatening to hang their leaders and lay waste to their land.
The British decided not just to threaten these mountain people, but to insult their honor. And they violated the most basic rule in the military book: never underestimate your enemy. What they didn't realize is that they were also signing their own death warrant.
These over-the-mountain men were outraged by Ferguson.
They saw him as a direct threat to their way of life. They saw him boasting that he could defeat the men in the backcountry, threatening to come into their settlements. They saw him as a presence that had to be put down, almost like a mad dog.
The frontiermen poured in from settlements in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the Carolinas, and from Tennessee. Kings Mountain was their final destination. Some traveled on horseback for weeks, determined to protect their homes and their families from outside interference. The stage was set for a battle that would change the course of the war. Ferguson, at the top of the mountain, held his 1,200 men in European battle formation. The 900 American militiamen fought as they did on the frontier, smart and decentralized. The battle was fierce, as 16-year-old Thomas Young recalled.
I stood behind one tree and fired until the bark was nearly all knocked off, and my eyes pretty well filled with it. One fella shaved me pretty close, for his bullet took a piece out of my gun stock.
These over-the-mountain men used every skill they'd learned from thousands of years of ugly, uncontrolled warfare. And they destroyed Ferguson's army.
The Americans lost only 28 men. The British suffered more than 500 casualties.
The Battle of Kings Mountain has been called the backcountry militia's finest hour. They showed what they can do under good leaders when they combined their forces and fought the way that they knew how to fight.
The rough backwoodsmen who fought these mountain battles rarely get a mention in the history books. They had names like Tidance Lane, John Smith, John Conley, William Miller, all ancestors of mine. Ordinary men who helped inspire America to a truly extraordinary victory.
And Kings Mountain was one of the pivotal events of the war.
In my opinion, the Scotch-Irish were extremely important to the outcome of the American Revolution. It's difficult to imagine that the Revolution would have turned out the same way had it not been for what happened here in the backcountry.
In 1783, when America won its independence, it acknowledged the efforts made by the overwhelmingly Scots-Irish militiamen in the South in the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
You ever wonder why Southerners feel so strongly about the right to bear arms? A key is the frontier experience. The militia concept had worked well for the Scots-Irish. On the frontier, an individual had the responsibility of defending himself, his home, and his family. Over time, that duty turned into a right, held strongly by people with a long history of mistrust of central government. There's a saying around here, "I'll give up my gun when you pry it out of my cold, dead hands."
In the years after America won its independence, the Scots-Irish were able to make themselves known for more than their fighting skills.
The impact of the Scots-Irish blossomed after America's independence. Thousands of families poured from the mountains, making settlements to the west and south. They brought their music and their whiskey with them, and as always, their strong fundamentalist beliefs. Fight, sing, drink, pray was about to be unleashed on a new American nation.
After America's War of Independence, the Scots-Irish communities flourished, and gradually they began transforming American culture.
In the years after the American Revolution, the Shenandoah Valley represented what ordinary people would do when they owned the land, when they worked the land, and when they developed independent ways of life, free from the controlling hand of an aristocracy. So the Shenandoah Valley became an embodiment, a model for a Republican society.
The optimism of the new nation was perfectly celebrated by the Scots-Irish music that began spilling out of the Shenandoah.
All of the immigrant groups that moved into Appalachia carried music to the table, if you will. But the Scots-Irish element, really that defined, in many ways, the tradition of the region.
We know that people did get together for house raisings, barn raisings, corn shuckings, and at those times they would have music and there would be dancing taking place. So it was a means of community get-together and a means of celebrating.
And the parties were helped along by another tradition the Scots-Irish imported from their homeland.
Men and women in the mountain settlements grew rye, wheat, and Indian corn or maize. These crops weren't just good to eat. They were easy to ferment and turn into the ultimate Scotch-Irish drink, whiskey.
The Scots-Irish brought traditions of making whiskey with grains. When they came into the New World, of course, suddenly they could add corn to the mix, and corn whiskey became part of the mountain tradition of making alcohol.
Whiskey was a way for the Scots-Irish to enjoy themselves and to make the greatest profit from their Appalachian farms.
On a small mountain farm where you had smaller patches of corn and things, that was a good way to turn that from a solid product into a liquid product, which was easier to take to the market.
The music and whiskey seeped out of the Scots-Irish communities and began to transform American culture. And the way they celebrated another spirit was to have an even more profound effect.
Scottish ancestors of these settlers had embraced a faith that taught them they were face to face with their own God. No kings, no bishops in between. That faith would serve them well out here, where even the preachers were few, and sometimes only God could hear them pray.
In the early days in America, Scots-Irish communities had been unified by the Presbyterian Church. Now, a lack of trained ministers on the frontier made the settlers seek spiritual comfort elsewhere. They found it from the Baptist and Methodist preachers who traveled the backcountry preaching eternal salvation, hellfire, and brimstone. Passionate conversion of whole Scots-Irish communities helped lay the basis for what we now call the American Bible Belt.
You'll find certainly in the area where the most Scotch-Irish are, in the South, is where the Baptist Church is the strongest single denomination. I think this has certainly had an impact on shaping the nature of American Christianity.
The early Scots-Irish arrivals placed God at the top of all their priorities, above money, land, or fame, and that attitude still dominates the Bible Belt today. Fight, sing, drink, pray, these traditions and values were part of the Scots-Irish DNA. And as the 1700s drew to a close, the next generation of Scots-Irish pioneers moved into new frontiers. They flooded into Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, all across the South, seeking new homes, virgin land, or just to satisfy their wanderlust. I still find it amazing to drive along roads where they used to walk.
Which reminds me of the Pioneers' Creed. The cowards never started. The weak died along the way. Only the strong survived.
Most Scots-Irish families had already braved an ocean in search of freedom, like the Jacksons from Bonnie Before. In the Carolinas, their son Andrew fought for American liberty as a child soldier and was battle-scarred. Now, in 1788, like many other Scots-Irish, Andrew was also heading west. He carried a few possessions and the values he'd learned from the war and from his Scots-Irish community: a hatred of tyranny, self-reliance, and the belief that personal freedom should be a right, not a privilege. I've come to Andrew Jackson's home in Nashville to understand how his Scots-Irish heritage changed America. A lawyer and celebrated general, Jackson took Scots-Irish values for the first time into national politics.
The boy soldier from the frontier wilderness who'd been slashed in the face during the American Revolution had become a tough, hardened combat leader. So tough, his own soldiers nicknamed him Old Hickory. By 1815, he had become a national hero, and soon Old Hickory would be heading for the White House.
For the ordinary voters who elected him 7th President of the United States in 1828, Andrew Jackson embodied the American dream. In this young nation, only ability should determine success. The Scots-Irish had nourished this egalitarian principle on the frontier, and Jackson used it to remake American politics. He gave the public greater control over government offices, and by 1840, all white males had the vote. Radical, populist, Jackson's democratic ideals undermined aristocratic elites and protected the weak.
Andrew Jackson was one of my great political heroes. He was our first up-from-the-bottom president, a man of the people, from the people, who never forgot the people who carry the hard work of our society. Jackson once said, "The great can protect themselves, but the poor and the humble require the arm and the shield of the law."
Andrew Jackson's legacy isn't flawless. He was a product of his time. But this fighting Scotch-Irish president changed the American political system and stopped the notion of a permanent aristocracy.
After Andrew Jackson, no president dared forget that it was the American people and not some special clique that had the power to put him into office.
And we do well to remember this today. Until his death in 1845, Jackson's powerful personality helped keep America's states united. Afterwards, the nation became increasingly divided. Differing views about the extent of federal control, slavery, and economic issues divided North and South. Most of the Scots-Irish communities in the South were self-sufficient, growing their own food, making their own clothes from linen, just as they had in Ireland. But the real money in the agricultural South came from one crop, king cotton. Most small-scale white farmers didn't grow cotton, and it was slaves at plantations like this who had the back-breaking job of picking the white gold. Southern leaders worried that ending slavery would cause economic collapse. They believed Abraham Lincoln would abolish it. When he became president in 1860, it meant secession from the Union and war. 11 Southern slave states withdrew from the Union and declared an independent government, the Confederacy. Most Scots-Irish communities in the South and border South fell within these Southern states, as well as in Kentucky and Missouri, which had not seceded. Men of all ages rushed to enlist. To them, it felt like a Northern invasion. But few were fighting to preserve slaveholding rights. Indeed, only a small fraction of whites in the South actually owned slaves.
Although the institution of slavery itself was the direct cause of the American Civil War, that doesn't mean that the men fighting for the Southern states, fighting for the Confederacy, were necessarily fighting to preserve the institution of slavery. In areas around the Appalachian Mountains, where there were very few slaves in those areas, those men were fighting for their state. They were fighting against what they saw as an invasion. They were fighting to protect their homes, the hearths, if you will, in order to protect their families. There were tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides of Scots-Irish descent. A much higher enlistment rate in the South.
At battles like Manassas in July 1861, both armies suffered huge losses, nearly 1 in every 10 becoming a casualty. But still, the soldiers kept enlisting in their thousands, and many were led by men from their own Scots-Irish culture. Many of the greatest generals on either side, men such as Ulysses Grant for the North and Stonewall Jackson for the South, were Scots-Irish.
Deeply religious, unyielding, Scots-Irish to the core, Stonewall Jackson was a complicated man, but he was a general of historic proportions. Before the war, Jackson taught here at the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington. He drilled his men hard in mobility and discipline, and his leadership in Civil War conflicts such as the Valley Campaign was brilliant and indispensable. The soldiers who so loyally fought under Jackson were overwhelmingly Scots-Irish, drawn from the Shenandoah Valley and the remote mountains of Virginia's far southwest. One of my ancestors, William John Jewell, served under Stonewall Jackson in the Davis Rifles of the 37th Virginia Regiment. Jewell was from the crags and hollows of far southwest Virginia, and like most people back there, I doubt he'd ever seen a slave, much less owned one. He served, as is so beautifully put on the Confederate Memorial in Arlington National Cemetery, not for fame or reward, not for place or for rank, but in simple obedience to duty as he understood it. Wounded at Cedar Mountain, wounded again at Antietam, William John Jewell fell at Chancellorsville. The massive bloodshed of the American Civil War startled the entire world. One of the war's darkest hours came in 1862 at Antietam. A Boston journalist described what he saw.
Words are inadequate to portray the scene. I counted 14 bodies lying together, literally in a heap, amid the corn rows on the hillside. The broad green leaves were sprinkled and stained with blood.
In a single day's fighting at Antietam, each army suffered more than 10,000 casualties. 23,000 Americans in total, more than on any other day in the nation's military history. The war dragged on for another 3 years. In 1865, the North eventually won, and America seemed more divided than ever. The North would go on to enjoy the victor's spoils. The South was left a devastated wreck. Tens of thousands of farms were left derelict. 2/3 of Southern wealth disappeared. The region was occupied and controlled by the North and isolated by the destruction of its railroads. But the greatest cost, by far, was in human terms. Scotch-Irish soldiers fought on both sides in the Civil War, although the Confederate Army was overwhelmingly Scotch-Irish. In 4 years of fighting, more than 620,000 Americans lost their lives, including 1 out of every 3 white Southern males between the ages of 18 and 40. There's an inscription on a lot of Confederate tombstones. How many dreams died here? The Civil War left the South still bleeding in an economic death spiral. Profits from natural resources traveled outside the region. And by 1870, 88% of America's wealth lay in the North, with the average Southern income less than 2/5 of Northern earnings. As always, ordinary people paid the price. And their children and grandchildren kept paying as economic decline suffocated individual opportunity. For 70 years following the Civil War, the South was a devastated place. Economically, it resembled a colony owned and controlled from outside the region. Educationally, even by the 1930s, the combined endowments of all the colleges and universities in the South was less than those of Harvard and Yale alone. The poverty trap unleashed by the Civil War and its aftermath attacked Scots-Irish communities in the south and further west on the plains. Where once they'd been proud farm owners, now many worked as tenants, known as sharecroppers. By 1936, 1.2 million of the South's 1.8 million sharecroppers were white, almost a mirror of the South's population, which was 71% white. Their Scots-Irish ancestors had fought full-scale wars. Now this generation battled economic devastation. And occasionally they died with their boots on, overcome by the brutality of survival. Just when it seemed things couldn't get any worse, they did. The Great Depression of the 1930s brought the entire country to its knees, even the prosperous North. It hit the already poor communities of the South hard, and people faced a stark choice: leave or starve.
Not far from here, there's a highway called Route 23, which begins in the southern Appalachians and ends in Detroit. People started calling this the Hillbilly Highway as the Appalachian Mountains emptied out into the factory belt of our north-central states. Further west, the Grapes of Wrath Highway brought this culture to the Pacific coast, particularly California. The Scots-Irish were going national.
Leaving the South didn't end the Scots-Irish culture. Instead, it became the basis for its greatest American legacy. New European immigrants gravitated toward the embracive Scots-Irish. Their values spread wherever they went: self-reliance, equality, fighting any dominance from above. And even as many Scots-Irish stopped viewing themselves as a distinct ethnic group, their values and traditions were reshaping America from the bottom up.
One of the stories that we tell about the Scotch-Irish is how over time they lost their Scotch-Irishness and they melded into the American landscape. There are those who would also argue that insofar as they became harder and harder to identify, they became more and more the mainstream of American development.
Against all odds, the Scots-Irish working class ethics are now basic American values. And the culture's resolve to battle oppression has shaped America's fighting spirit as well. As in my family, this tradition has been passed down through the generations. Men and women of Scots-Irish descent have continually swollen the ranks of America's military. They have always filled the Marine Corps, our most elite service. In every war of the 20th century, West Virginia was first, second, or third among casualty rates in our states. They still fight for America today. The resolute fighting spirit the Scots-Irish carried into the Appalachian Mountains so long ago has defined America's politics and her military. And Scots-Irish musical traditions have evolved to become a defining sound of America. The music that used to fill the Appalachian hollows now has found a home here in Nashville.
The real backbone in the beginning of modern country day music would certainly have to go back to the fiddle and banjo tradition, which the fiddle tradition certainly did come out of Ireland and Scotland.
Country music is now seen as 100% American, like so much of the Scots-Irish culture. Whiskey is popular from Alaska to Alabama. And the Bible Belt's Christianity, much of that was nurtured in Scotland and Ireland. Fight, sing, drink, pray. Over the centuries, the Scots-Irish defined mainstream American life, and they didn't stop there.
Scotch-Irish attitudes may have helped shape America from the bottom up, but this is a very competitive culture, and many of its members have reached the very top.
The Scots-Irish traits of individualism and ambition have sent no less than 17 men of Scots-Irish descent to the White House. That's nearly half of all presidents since Andrew Jackson. And it's not just in politics they've excelled. Some of the nation's greatest entrepreneurs, like Andrew Mellon, were Scots-Irish to the core. Even the First Lady of Civil Rights, Rosa Parks, had a stubborn Scots-Irish great-grandfather. And Neil Armstrong's progress to the moon began many centuries ago when his ancestors left Scotland to start a new life in the north of Ireland.
And so the Scots-Irish, who are they? They are the molten core at the very center of the unbridled, raw, rebellious spirit of America. They helped build this country from the bottom up. They faced the world on their feet and not on their knees. They were born fighting. And if the cause is right, they will never give up.